Get ready, start. Following the introduction of the newly drafted Land Acquisition, Resettlement and Rehabilitation Bill in the Lok Sabha in September 2011, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Rural Development undertook a thorough review of the bill. In May this year, the committee submitted its report containing recommendations for modification and amendment to the legislation, a key legislative initiative of the UPA to government. This important bill seeks to replace the existing 1894 law on the subject. It entails a comprehensive revisit drawing upon the lessons of forced displacement and severely inadequate compensation that have characterized almost all past land acquisitions. The simple, most significant, and far reaching recommendation made by the Standing Committee relates to the omission of the state as a party to the process of acquisition. The committee, in its wisdom, believes that a party requiring land should negotiate the process of its purchase oblique acquisition directly with the owner without involving state agencies as arbitrator or intervener. Despite addressing the same subject matter, the legislative epicenter of this new bill is not the same or even similar to the existing law. While the current law pits the absolute might of the state against individuals whom it itself disempowers, the new bill greatly narrows the power of the state and significantly empowers those marginalized sectors that are at the greatest risk of being displaced. In other words, the new law invests in the individual justiciable authority while diminishing that of the state. The existing law does the opposite. Removing the state from the process of acquisition is both undesirable and infeasible for the following reasons. Firstly, the sheer inequality in terms of bargaining power between large scale corporations and small farmers and other marginalized groups increases the likelihood of unfair agreements. Contracts tends to be signed in favor of the party negotiating from a greater position of strength. That is why government is required to bridge the gap and bring balance to this relationship. Government is the big stick to defend the rights of the disenfranchised. Secondly, a legitimate need for acquisition by the state itself to build public good such as roads, schools, and hospitals can be undermined and stalled by groups with vested interests. If there is no sovereign power to compel these groups, a single individual or group of individuals can hold a process hostage if they so desire merely by refusing to part with land for selfish reasons or sometimes even without reason. Furthermore, in times of crisis such as war, famine, and floods, coupled with absence of legislation clarifying and guiding the state's exercise of eminent domain, situations can emerge jeopardizing human lives. Thirdly, land can be acquired indiscriminately through transactions between private parties without giving any thought to its impact on surrounding areas and ecosystems. Many middle class Indians, when questioned, are quick to answer that they are non political. The same people would strongly advocate that every adult should vote, the most obviously political act in an electoral democracy. Politics permeates almost every aspect of our lives, and to create artificial divisions between our politics and ourselves causes confusion in how both our society and our politics is shaped. No social movement could therefore fail to recognize its relationship with political thought and action. The discourse in recent times has created arbitrary lines separating social and political movements. It has projected the political as being tainted, and this separation has alienated many of us from reasoned political thought and action. Civil society, in the immediate context, is a buzzword wrapped in ambiguity. The media has helped project it as an utopian monolith expected to cleanse the road in the political system. Even the way we define civil society spells exclusiveness. It was expected to bring together an intrinsically hierarchical and divisive society which would confront politicians and their institutions. A popular protest can bring these divergent sectors together for some time. However, it would be a mistake to romanticize or worse, equate civil society with a movement. A campaign needs to work out details and a movement needs to have its own internal logic, sweeping away all complicities and reducing the debate to black and white raises a threat to democracy itself. Social movements recognize this complicity and see themselves as a part of a larger political process. There is an innate understanding of the politics of fighting, oppression, and exclusion, and many have enriched and used democratic spaces that electoral politics does not offer. The leaders of the independence movement were political but with symbiotic connections with a vast range of social movements with stated ideologies. Social movements had strong ideological and political differences, but they demonstrated a deep commitment to democratic debate with a fundamental respect for defense and dissent. The independence movement was therefore a collection of a variety of socio political movements of depth and vision. Some sustained the political parties they shaped Gandhiji, Ambedkar, Netaji, M.N. Roy. The communists and many more continued to influence our political future. They fought for independence from the British despite sharp differences of a vision of India. Those visions were shaped by the social movements they helped establish. Some took public office, others like Gandhiji and Jayaprakash Narayan did not embedded as they were in political discourse. These visionaries believed that sustained change would primarily emerge from participatory democratic processes. Leaders do not give birth to movements on the country, leaders emerge from them. A legal framework by itself is insufficient and is only a consequence of a movement that has already drawn large numbers of people into a sustained process. Stop.